Good morning. We're in the book of Jonah this morning, jumping back into our series that we paused last Sunday. So hope you'll open a Bible, digital or physical, and follow along through this great story of Jonah. In some ways, Kendra and I feel like we have moved from the land of straight roads to the land of not so straight roads. When we lived in Memphis, Tennessee, and we wanted to drive to Nashville to visit our daughter, Jordan. For the most part, with a few exceptions, it was a 3-hour straight line. When we wanted to go to our favorite restaurants in Memphis, for the most part, with very few exceptions, it was a series of straight lines. But now we live in a land of not so straight lines. And one thing that we've learned is that driving in Connecticut is not linear. I remember the first time I plugged in Chipotle to Google Maps. This was before the Chipotle just down the street opened up. And I followed Google Maps to the one that is, I guess, in Darien. And it took me down this long, winding series of roads, and I thought for certain Google Maps had lost its mind. Or the first time I plugged in Home Depot in Google Maps, and it took me through a series of meandering roads that finally made their way there. It seems there are not many straightforward ways to get from here to there in Connecticut. Now, we've gotten used to it, but it was a bit disconcerting at the beginning. Last November, we had a contemplative retreat here at the church building. We're having another one today. It's also available online. One of the things that we did at that retreat in November, we'll also do this afternoon, and that is to offer an opportunity to walk the prayer labyrinth. And one of the things that struck me last November when I walked the prayer labyrinth that we have was that walking a labyrinth is not linear. A labyrinth is not a maze. There are no dead ends. There are no wrong turns to take. Basically, if you get on the path and you stay on the path, you will make your way to the center, and then you will make your way back out of the labyrinth. But what struck me was the number of times when I would have to turn away from the center where I was trying to go, and the number of steps that I took in the exact opposite of the center where I was wanting to go. But that's how it is with labyrinths. And really, as long as you stay on that path, you'll eventually get where you want to go. This morning, using the book of Jonah, I want to meditate on this truth that life is not linear. We're looking at some of the most frequently occurring words in the book of Jonah, believing that these frequently occurring words give us a clue to the message and the relevance of that story for today. Time and time again, there are two words that show up in the narrative, often translated with our English words up and down. The narrative through Jonah, the path through Jonah, is a series of ups and downs. There are very few straight lines in the story of Jonah. Let's look briefly at 9 texts in the story that reveal this up and down pattern throughout the story, and then we'll talk about 4 implications of that for our lives. So the story begins with God telling Jonah to arise, to get up, and go to Nineveh. Verse 1, arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me. The evil of the people of Nineveh has risen up to God, so God tells Jonah to get up and go to Nineveh. Jonah does get up, but he does not go to Nineveh, verse 3. But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish. Jonah does get up, but he heads in the exact opposite direction of Nineveh. He flees to Tarshish, about as far away in the ancient world as you could get from Nineveh. And this begins a bit of a downward turn in his journey. So verse 3, he went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and went down into it. Jonah is supposed to get up and go to Nineveh, and now he's going down to nearby Joppa and going down into the belly of a ship so he can flee to Tarshish. And of course, God sees all of this. Nothing happens in the story outside of God's notice. And so God sends a great storm on the sea to stop the boat from going to Tarshish. And the captain of the boat comes to Jonah and begs him to pray, to get up and to pray to his God about the storm. So verse 6, so the captain came and said to him, "Arise, call out to your God. Perhaps the God will give a thought to us that we may not perish." Jonah then tells the captain and the sailors on the boat to pick him up and throw him out of the boat. Chapter 1, verse 12, he said to them, "Pick me up and hurl me into the sea, then the sea will quiet down for you. For I know it is because of me that this great tempest has come upon you." So they picked up Jonah and hurled him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. Jonah was invited by God to get up and go to Nineveh, and now Jonah invites the men to pick him up and throw him into the ocean. And of course, this begins a downward spiral in the journey. He ends up in the belly of a great fish who carries him to the depths of the ocean. And from there, he prays to his God. So chapter 2, verse 3, Jonah speaking in prayer to God. "For you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the floods surrounded me. All your waves and your billows passed over me. The waters closed in over me to take my life. The deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped about my head at the roots of the mountains. I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever." Jonah rebelliously and voluntarily went down to Joppa and down to the belly of a ship, and now he is forced into the belly of a fish and taken down to the depths of the ocean. Thankfully, God raises Jonah up in a bit of a vile way. Chapter 2, verse 6, Jonah says, "Yet you brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God." And the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah out upon the dry land. Sometimes when God raises you up, there are all kinds of icky consequences. Once again, Jonah is invited by God to arise and to go to Nineveh, chapter 3, verse 1. Then the word of the Lord came to Jonah the second time, saying, "Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it in the message that I tell you." So Jonah arose and went to Nineveh, according to the word of the Lord. Jonah gets up and now goes to Nineveh, preaches the word of the Lord. The people hear the word, repent. God relents of the disaster he was about to send upon them, and all is well. Or not. Jonah 4, verse 5. Jonah went out of the city and sat to the east of the city and made a booth for himself there. He sat under it in the shade till he should see what would become of the city. Now the Lord God appointed a plant and made it come up over Jonah, so that it might be a shade over his head, to save him from his discomfort. So Jonah was exceedingly glad because of the plant. Seeing how God relents on the people of Nineveh, how God forgives their sin, acts in mercy toward their sin, displeases Jonah. And so he heads out of the city to sulk in the hot sun. And just as God appointed a fish to take him down to the depths of the ocean, God appoints a plant to rise up to provide shade for Jonah. And here at the end of the story, we're not entirely sure if Jonah is going up or if Jonah is going down. But one thing has become very clear through the book of Jonah. Through these literal ups and downs, we hear that life, even with God, is not linear. Maybe especially with God, is not linear. It is a myth to think that there is a straight line that we can take with God to go quickly and easily from immature to mature, from hurting to healed, from sinner to saint, from abandoned to befriended, from questions to answers, from purposelessness to purposefulness. We will be happier and healthier if we can simply learn to embrace the winding nature of life with God. Sometimes these ups and downs in the story of Jonah are brought about by Jonah. Sometimes they are brought about by God. Sometimes they are brought about by other people. But one thing is clear from the story of Jonah: life with God is not linear. And so let me share 4 overlapping implications of this for our own lives. Number 1, realizing that life is not linear keeps us from despair in general when we're unhappy. In January 2020, the Hollywood Reporter held a round table with 6 actors. There were 2 young actors, Shia LaBeouf and Adam Driver, 2 middle-aged actors, Jamie Foxx and Adam Sandler, and then 2 seasoned actors, Robert De Niro and Tom Hanks. And at one point in the round table, the interviewer asked Tom Hanks and Robert De Niro, "What do you wish you had known?" That is, what have you learned that you wished you had known much earlier in your career? And Tom Hanks immediately said, "I wish I had known this too shall pass." And he explained, "Are you upset? Are you unhappy? Are you angry? This too shall pass." He said, "Time is your ally. Wait. Sit it through. This too shall pass." I think that's an implication of the up and down nature of life with God. It's very easy for us to feel great despair over things like COVID, over things like the deep divisions within our own country, over ongoing experiences of things like racism or sexism. And indeed, those things should bring despair. But those things are not the entire journey. They are part of the up and down nature of life, even with God. And even when you find yourself in the belly of a fish, in the depths of the ocean, you can know that there will come a time when you find yourself safe and secure, if a little smelly, on the beach. Because life, even with God, is not linear. Second, realizing that life is not linear keeps us from despair when we're in recovery, whether it's from an illness, a trauma, or addiction. There just is not a straight line when it comes to illness, from being sick to being healed. There's not a straight line when it comes to trauma, from being traumatized to being healed. There's not a straight line when it comes to recovery from addiction to sobriety. There's a series of ups and downs. And so if you find yourself in the midst of an illness, and this last week you've been feeling bad again, it's part of the journey, but it's not the whole journey. There are better days ahead. If you find yourself continuing to recover from trauma, and this last week something has triggered that trauma again, take heart. That's part of the journey, but it's not the whole journey. And if you're in recovery from addiction and you experienced a setback this last week, that's okay. It is part of the journey. Every week we have a number of recovery groups that meet in this facility. And most weeks I see participants from most of those groups arrive. They park in the parking lot. They greet each other in the parking lot. They walk side by side through the door by the office, and then they find whatever space they use in this facility. I've gotten to know by sight more of those who come to the Wednesday night Alcoholics Anonymous group than any other group. I almost always see them on Wednesday nights at around 5, parking, greeting, walking in through the door by the office. I've spoken to a few of them individually. Sometimes when I'm headed down the hallway to go to our house for dinner before Wednesday night Bible class, I've stopped in the library where they meet, and I've offered a word of welcome just to greet them. And one thing strikes me about that group. For the most part, it is the same group of individuals every Wednesday. There are new faces that come and go in that group, but for almost a year, I've seen the same group of individuals arrive at this building and spend an hour processing their road to sobriety together. Why is that? Well, it's because the road to sobriety is not a straight line. You can't just come to one meeting and you're done. It is a long journey that requires constant encouragement and community. Number 3, realizing that life is not linear keeps us from despair when we're experiencing discontent in our spiritual life. Hundreds of years ago, there was a man named St. John of the Cross, and he kind of normalized what so many people experience. He called it the dark night of the soul. And in so many words, St. John of the Cross said, if you're a devout follower of Jesus, you're very likely going to experience a season or seasons when the spiritual things that normally brought you joy no longer do. When God Himself feels distant and disengaged from your life and your world. And when that happens, you need to know that is normal. It is part of the journey. It is not the whole journey, but it is a common occurrence. And in so many ways, I feel like that is where a lot of followers of Jesus are during these COVID times. I think in many ways, many Christians are experiencing a dark night of the soul, when the routines, the habits, the practices that used to bring them joy just no longer do. And God feels distant and disengaged. And I guess what I'd like to say is that's okay. It's part of the journey. And number 4, realizing that life is not linear keeps us from despair when we've sinned. You notice that a lot of the downward slide in Jonah's story is the result of Jonah. His arrogance, his pride, his racial and ethnic bias. And yet, that doesn't stop God from doing what He's going to do through Jonah for the people of Nineveh. God instigates, God intervenes, God forgives, and the will of God moves on. And the same thing is true for you. You might, in this very moment, be at a low point in your life because of a sin in your life. And what you need to know is that moment, that season, does not define the journey. It is a series of ups and downs. And it will not stop God from doing what God is going to do through you for others. God will initiate, He will instigate, He will intervene, He will forgive, and the journey goes on. Sam Farmer lives in Massachusetts. When he was a child, he had great difficulty processing information mentally. He had great difficulty with social skills. And so he was mocked. He was bullied a great deal in school. When he was 40, he was finally diagnosed as being on the autism spectrum. And he eventually wrote a book about his experience as a child, living through those challenges without any diagnosis, and then living as an adult with that diagnosis and those challenges. And here's the title of the book: A Long Walk Down a Winding Road. A long walk down a winding road. And I think in many ways that's a helpful way to name Jonah's experience and our experience with God. It's a long walk down a winding road. And sometimes you're turning in the exact opposite direction from where you want to go. But if you'll just stay on the path, it will eventually get you where you need to go. And I think you'll find it is a path worth walking. Let's take just a few moments in silence, a few seconds in silence to consider this statement. The winding nature of life with God means that I can. Take a few seconds to finish that statement for yourself.